Picture two people standing at the exact same crossroads. Same opportunity in front of them. Same amount of information available. Same amount of risk on the table. One of them makes a decision in about 30 seconds based on how they feel in the moment. The other pauses, runs through something in their mind that most people never even notice is happening, and then acts. 6 months later, one of them is dealing with the fallout of a rushed choice. The other is standing on solid ground, wondering why more people don't just think things through the way they did. The gap between those two outcomes wasn't luck, and it wasn't intelligence either, because both people were perfectly capable of making a good decision. The gap was in the thinking itself, in a process so quiet and so fast that it's almost invisible from the outside. Before we get into exactly what that process looks like, if you want more breakdowns like this one, practical, honest, built to actually change how you operate day to day, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to hear isn't abstract philosophy. It's the actual mental habits successful people rely on before they ever take action. And once you see them clearly, you won't be able to unsee them in your own decisions. Jim Rohn spent a lifetime observing something that fascinated him. The outcomes people got in life were rarely random, and they were rarely just about effort either. Two people could work equally hard, want the same things equally badly, and still end up in completely different places. And the difference almost always traced back to the quality of thinking that happened before the action, not the amount of hustle that happened after it. He put it simply, motion and action get confused a lot. He'd say, you can be busy without producing anything, and the busyness of action, without the clarity of thought behind it, doesn't add up to progress. It just adds up to exhaustion. Today, we're going to walk through the actual thinking patterns that separate people who consistently make good decisions from people who consistently don't. Not as abstract theory, but as specific, learnable habits of mind you can start applying immediately, starting with the very next decision, sitting in front of you. Let's start with the first pattern, and it might be the most foundational one of all. Successful people separate the decision from the emotion attached to it. Here's what happens for most people when a decision shows up. A choice needs to be made, and immediately, before any actual thinking happens, an emotional reaction arrives first. Excitement, fear, pressure, insecurity, whatever it is. That feeling shows up almost instantly. And for most people, that feeling essentially makes the decision on their behalf. They call it going with their gut. But very often what's actually happening is that their gut is really just their fear or their excitement wearing a disguise, and the actual thinking part gets skipped entirely. People who consistently make good decisions have trained themselves to notice that gap, the small space between the moment a decision appears and the moment they actually act on it. And they've learned to slow down inside that gap. Instead of rushing through it, they feel the same fear, the same excitement, the same pressure everyone else feels. They're not wired differently. The difference is they've built the habit of asking a simple question before acting. Is this feeling giving me useful information, or is it just noise? Sometimes fear is legitimate, a real warning worth listening to. Sometimes it's just discomfort with the unfamiliar, dressed up to look like danger. The only way to tell the difference is to pause long enough to actually look at it, instead of letting the emotion make the call by default. The second pattern follows naturally from the first. Successful people think in terms of consequences, not just outcomes. Most people, when they're weighing a decision, ask themselves one question. What happens if this works out? It's a natural question to ask, and it's not a bad one. But on its own, it's dangerously incomplete, because it only accounts for the version of the future where everything goes right. People who consistently make sound decisions ask a second question right alongside the first one. What happens if this doesn't work out? And can I live with that? This isn't pessimism, and it isn't about assuming the worst is going to happen. It's about making sure a decision can survive contact with reality, not just with an optimistic daydream. There's a specific kind of clarity that comes from genuinely sitting with the downside of a choice instead of glossing over it. Sometimes that clarity confirms the decision is worth making, because even the worst realistic outcome is something you could recover from. And sometimes that clarity reveals a risk that was quietly being ignored, one that, if you'd only asked yourself what happens if this works, you never would have seen coming until it was already too late to do anything about it. The people who build lasting success aren't the ones who take reckless risks and get lucky. They're the ones who take calculated risks because they did the uncomfortable work of imagining the downside before it ever became their reality. The third pattern is one that tends to separate people almost more than any other on this list. Successful people ask what they can control before they ask what they can't. Think about how much of a typical day gets spent thinking, talking, and worrying about things completely outside a person's control. The economy, other people's opinions, decisions made by someone else entirely. Circumstances that were already set in motion long before that person entered the picture. It's an easy trap to fall into because those things often feel urgent and important, and worrying about them can feel like a form of preparation, even though it changes absolutely nothing about the outcome. People who think clearly before they act have trained themselves to run a quick filter on every situation. What part of this is actually mine to influence? Sometimes the honest answer is not much. And in those moments, the mature response is to acknowledge that and redirect energy elsewhere instead of continuing to spin on something unchangeable, but very often buried underneath all the noise of what can't be controlled. There's a smaller, specific thing that absolutely can be a decision, an action, a response, a next step. Successful people have a habit of finding that small, controllable piece quickly and putting their energy directly into it, instead of losing days or weeks stuck in frustration over the much larger piece they were never going to be able to move. Anyway, the fourth pattern is subtle but incredibly powerful. Successful people think in terms of identity, not just goals. Most people set goals the same basic way. They decide what they want, whether that's a certain income, a certain body, a certain level of success, and then they try to force their way toward it through sheer willpower and discipline. This can work for a little while, but it tends to be fragile because willpower is a limited resource that runs out under stress. There's a different approach that tends to produce far more durable results, and it starts with a different question entirely. Instead of asking, "What do I want to achieve?" the question becomes, "What kind of person would naturally achieve this?" And then, am I becoming that person? This shifts the entire decision-making process. Instead of white-knuckling your way through every individual choice, you start asking a simpler, more automatic question in the moment. Would the version of me who has already built this life make this particular decision? Someone who has internalized the identity of a disciplined, healthy person doesn't have to talk themselves into a difficult workout through sheer force of willpower every single day, because skipping it would feel inconsistent with who they've decided they are. And that internal consistency does a huge amount of the work that willpower used to have to do all on its own. This is why two people with identical goals and identical information can end up in completely different places. One is fighting their own impulses through raw effort every single day. The other has quietly rebuilt their sense of self around the outcome they want, and their decisions simply follow from that new identity almost automatically. The fifth pattern is one that Jim Rohn talked about constantly, in different forms, throughout his entire career. Successful people think in decades, while unsuccessful people think in days. This doesn't mean successful people ignore what's happening right in front of them. Quite the opposite. They're often intensely focused on the present moment. What it means is that every present decision gets filtered through a much longer timeline before it's acted on. A short-term thinker facing a difficult, boring, uncomfortable task asks a simple, narrow question. Does this feel good right now? And if the honest answer is no, that's often enough to justify skipping it or putting it off. A long-term thinker facing that exact same task asks a completely different question. Will this matter in 5 years? And very often, the answer to that second question points in a completely different direction than the answer to the first one did. This single shift in questioning explains an enormous amount of the gap between people who build something lasting and people who stay stuck cycling through the same year over and over again. The workout that feels pointless today compounds into a decade of health. The book read after a long, tiring day compounds into a decade of expertise. The uncomfortable conversation avoided today compounds into a decade of the exact same conflict, repeating itself in slightly different forms, in relationship after relationship, job after job, because it was never actually resolved the first time. Long-term thinkers aren't willing to sacrifice their future for their present comfort. And that single willingness, repeated consistently over years, is responsible for more real success than almost any other factor on this entire list. The sixth pattern might be the most counterintuitive one here. Successful people actively seek out disagreement before making important decisions. Most people do the opposite without even realizing it. When they're leaning toward a particular choice, they instinctively gravitate toward people and information that will confirm they're right. And they instinctively avoid people and information that might challenge that conclusion. This feels completely natural because disagreement is uncomfortable and confirmation feels good. But this habit quietly creates enormous blind spots because it means important decisions get made inside an echo chamber, built entirely out of validation, with all the actual weaknesses of the plan conveniently filtered out before they were ever heard. People who consistently make strong decisions have trained themselves to do something that goes directly against this natural instinct. Before committing to something important, they deliberately seek out the perspective of someone who's likely to disagree, or at least push back. And they actually listen to what that person has to say, instead of just waiting for their turn to defend their original position. This isn't about being talked out of good decisions by every skeptic who comes along. Plenty of good ideas survive tough scrutiny completely intact. It's about making sure a decision has actually been tested before real money, real time, or real relationships get put on the line. Instead of discovering the flaw only after it's already too late to course correct cheaply. The seventh pattern is closely connected to that last one. Successful people distinguish clearly between information and noise. We live in an era with more access to information than any previous generation in human history. And counterintuitively, this has made clear thinking harder for a lot of people, not easier. Because alongside genuinely useful information, there's an overwhelming volume of noise, other people's opinions, secondhand outrage, speculation dressed up as fact, all competing for the exact same attention. People who think clearly before they act have built a habit of asking a specific question about the information reaching them. Is this something I can actually verify or apply, or is this just opinion wearing the costume of fact? This filtering habit protects them from a particular trap that ensnares a lot of otherwise smart people. The trap of making decisions based on secondhand panic or secondhand hype, instead of based on their own careful evaluation of their actual situation. It also protects their mental bandwidth because a mind constantly absorbing unfiltered noise has very little capacity left over for the deep, focused thinking that good decisions actually require. The eighth pattern is one that tends to show up specifically in the way successful people handle failure before it even happens. They plan for setbacks in advance instead of being blindsided by them. Most people approach a new venture, a new goal, a new relationship with an unspoken assumption sitting quietly underneath everything. The assumption that if they're serious enough, disciplined enough, prepared enough, things will basically go according to plan. And then, when something inevitably goes wrong, because something always eventually does, They experience it as a crisis, a sign that maybe they weren't cut out for this, after all, or that the whole plan was flawed from the start. People who think ahead approach this completely differently. Before they even begin, they ask themselves what's likely to go wrong along the way, not to talk themselves out of starting, but to remove the shock and the emotional derailment when those obstacles inevitably show up. When a setback happens to someone who anticipated the possibility of setbacks, it registers as, "This is the part I expected. Let's work through it." When that exact same setback happens to someone who assumed everything would go smoothly, it registers as a crisis that can derail momentum, confidence, and sometimes the entire project, for weeks or even permanently. The obstacle itself is often identical in both cases. The only real difference is whether it was anticipated in advance or not. The ninth pattern is one Jim Rohn returned to again and again throughout his talks. Successful people evaluate decisions based on the direction they point, not just their immediate size. A lot of people dismiss small decisions as unimportant because on their own, in isolation, they genuinely are small. Reading for 20 minutes instead of scrolling doesn't change a life by itself. One healthy meal doesn't transform a body by itself. One kind word doesn't repair a relationship by itself. But people who think clearly understand something that a lot of people miss entirely, which is that no decision actually exists in isolation. Every choice is really a vote for the direction a person's life is headed. And while any single vote is small, the cumulative direction of thousands of those votes cast consistently over months and years is enormous. This is why successful people often seem almost disproportionately careful about small, seemingly insignificant decisions that most people would never think twice about. They're not being obsessive or uptight. They simply understand that they're not just choosing this one meal or this 1 hour or this one response. They're casting another vote for the type of person they're steadily becoming, one small decision at a time. And they'd rather that steady direction be an intentional one than an accidental one. The 10th and final pattern brings everything else on this list together. Successful people make peace with imperfect information and decide anyway. Here's a trap that catches a lot of intelligent, thoughtful people, specifically because they are intelligent and thoughtful. The more someone understands about a decision, the more they tend to become aware of everything they still don't know. And that awareness can create a kind of paralysis, a feeling that more research, more certainty, more preparation is needed before it's safe to actually act. And in a world that's constantly changing, that feeling of needing just a little more certainty first can be chased indefinitely, because complete certainty about the future essentially doesn't exist for anyone, no matter how much information they gather. People who consistently move forward and build real results have made peace with a specific, uncomfortable truth. Nearly every meaningful decision in life has to be made with incomplete information. And waiting for that discomfort to fully disappear before acting means, in practice, waiting forever. They've learned to ask a more useful question than, "Do I know everything I need to know?" They ask instead, "Do I know enough to take the next responsible step? And can I adjust course as I learn more along the way?" This single shift from demanding certainty to accepting reasonable confidence is often the exact thing separating someone who's been planning the same project for 3 years from someone who started imperfectly 18 months ago and has already learned, adjusted, and improved along the way 3 separate times since then. So here's the pattern running quietly underneath every single one of these 10 mental habits. None of them are about being smarter than everyone else. And none of them require some rare natural talent that only a lucky few are born with. They're about the specific questions someone asks themselves consistently in the small window of time between a decision appearing and an action being taken. Is this feeling giving me real information or just noise? What happens if this doesn't work? And can I live with that? What part of this is actually mine to control? Would the version of me who's already built this life make this choice? Will this matter in 5 years? Have I actually stress tested this against real disagreement? Is this information or just noise wearing information's costume? What's likely to go wrong? And am I prepared for that possibility? What direction is this really voting for? And do I know enough to take the next step, even without complete certainty? None of these questions take more than a few seconds to ask, but asking them consistently, decision after decision, year after year, produces a completely different life than never asking them at all. Even when two people started with identical circumstances, identical resources, and identical amounts of raw effort. This is why the old idea of the great entrepreneur, athlete, or leader who simply trusted their gut and never overthought anything doesn't hold up particularly well once you actually study how these people made their real decisions up close. What often looks like fast, instinctive decision-making from the outside is usually the visible tip of a thinking process that's been trained and refined over years, until it happens quickly enough that it looks effortless to everyone watching. From a distance, the instinct wasn't magic, and it wasn't luck. It was pattern recognition built from consistently asking better questions long enough that the process eventually became automatic. This is genuinely good news, because it means this kind of clear thinking isn't a fixed trait you either have or don't have. It's a skill built the exact same way every other skill gets built, through consistent, deliberate practice, starting clumsy and slow, and gradually becoming faster and more natural with repetition. Think about what's actually at stake here, because none of this is really about decision-making as some abstract skill sitting off to the side of real life. It's about every single significant outcome that decision-making eventually produces. The relationships built or damaged by decisions made in anger instead of clarity. The financial security built or lost by decisions made on emotion instead of genuine calculation. The careers built or stalled by opportunities seized with sound judgment or missed entirely because fear disguised itself as caution. The health preserved or damaged by decisions made for short-term comfort instead of long-term well-being. Every single major outcome in a person's life eventually traces back to a long chain of individual decisions. And the quality of that chain is determined almost entirely by the quality of thinking that happened just before each individual link in it. Improve the thinking, even slightly, and every single outcome downstream from it improves along with it, sometimes in ways that don't become fully visible for years, but that are unmistakable in hindsight when you finally look back at the whole picture. The genuinely encouraging part of all this is that you don't need to master all 10 of these patterns simultaneously to see real change start to happen. In fact, trying to overhaul your entire thinking process all at once would probably backfire, the same way trying to fix 10 bad habits simultaneously usually does. Pick just one of these 10 patterns, whichever one struck you the hardest while you were listening just now, the one where you thought, that's exactly the mistake I keep making. And the very next time a real decision shows up in your life, even a small one, deliberately apply just that one pattern before you act. Notice the emotion instead of automatically obeying it. Ask what happens if this doesn't work out. Ask what part of the situation is actually yours to control. That one small shift, repeated consistently, decision after decision, is exactly how this becomes automatic over time. The same slow, compounding way every other worthwhile skill gets built. Jim Rohn spent his life teaching that success isn't really an accident, and neither is failure. They're both the natural, predictable result of a long chain of decisions made either with clarity or without it. You now have 10 specific, learnable patterns that separate those two chains from each other. And knowing them is genuinely the easy part. The real difference gets made in the next decision sitting in front of you, the one waiting right now, today, this week, however small it might currently seem. If this video gave you something worth carrying into that decision, take a second and hit that subscribe button, because we've got a lot more of this ahead, and I'd genuinely like to have you here for it. The people who build extraordinary lives were never smarter than everyone else in the room. They simply learned to think a little more clearly, a little more consistently, right before they acted. And they kept doing it long enough for that clarity to quietly reshape everything else that followed.